Hey, thank you all for coming. Welcome back to another look, and we'll get started with a few introductory remarks by yours truly. Thanks again to a number of people. Cynthia Haven, first off, for her continued kind of heroic keeping entitled opinions alive. We have, I'm going to thank the same two donors. I'm hoping, we'll get more in the future, but, I would like to thank Antonia Cross and Mary Pope Osborne, who contributed gracefully, and we're still living off those donations, along with contributions from continuing studies to a certain extent. And Robert Edgars is there making sure that everything is properly recorded and then eventually posted on our YouTube channel. For those of all of you who are not here present, either in person or on our live online audience. And I'd like to introduce Michaela Hulstyn. She's a lecturer in the Structured Liberal Education Program, otherwise known as SLE here at Stanford. That's a first-year residential education program here at Stanford, and I think some of her students are present here. It's nice to have freshmen in this audience. Michaela just published a book, I think, in 2022 or 3. I think it was 2022, a really great book called Unselfing Global French Literature at the Limits of Consciousness. And her research interests are in French and Francophone literature. She got her PhD in my department of French and Italian. And her research interests include 20th and 21st century French and Francophone literature, phenomenology of the self and intersubjectivity, cognitive approaches to transcultural literature, and the literature as ethical philosophy. So we're looking forward to her remarks after I finish my own, which will get us underway in our discussion of Kamel Daoud's Meursault investigation. Tobias Wolff, obviously, here, and apart from being, the eminent novelist, short story writer, he's also the founder of Another Look. And I just wanted to mention that the reason Another Look is still going on after, I think it's 8 years, if I'm not mistaken, is that I came to the last session when Toby was still the director, and you were going to let it drop and retire, and the discussion was Albert Camus' The Stranger. Remember that? And I couldn't get into the door because it was so packed with people, including, my own general physician. He was out there. I said, Seth, what are you doing here? He said, well, I want to hear something about Albert Camus, The Stranger. And, so fortunately, I was able to muscle my way in, and I thought it would be a real shame to let this institution just kind of fade away. As you know, it was founded by Toby as a gift to the community, where we would disseminate a novel or a book to be read by everyone in advance, and then congregate here or elsewhere in person to discuss, a particular book. And so I agreed to take it over, and I got funding from continuing studies, and I don't know, 7 or 8 years. I don't even count anymore because it's a lot. And here we are. We're still going strong with another great book for discussion. Kamel Daoud is a really interesting guy. I've been in communication with him through writing. I don't know how many of you were able to read the interview that I had that was published in the LA Review of Books for the occasion for our own Another Look discussion. And he makes a comment there about his relationship to Camus and France, and the way in which this novel that we're going to be discussing tonight is an engagement with and dialogue with, a response to, a critique of this classic, what has become a classic novel, Camus, The Stranger, which was under discussion back when. And I'm trying to find here how he mentioned on what he says, I refuse to read novels with a passport in my head. And that statement is actually, within the academic context, quite radical, because if you try to write a novel about Algeria, and if you're not Algerian, or if you have, you'll be accused of cultural appropriation. But this idea that you can be without a national passport when it comes to literature is an idea that I would like to put forward and champion, because as he goes on to say, literature has always been an escape for me, including an escape from my own country and its cult of the dead. This cult of the dead plays a huge role in the book. Obviously, we're talking about a dead Arab, the mother of the dead Arab, the brother of the dead Arab, and what Algeria still today calls, itself the land of 1 million martyrs. It's almost 1 million people that, died during the War of Independence. And there's something, I'd just like to make one comment about the what it is about literature that offers us a kind of freedom from certain forms of determination. I came across something online actually today, which I took a photo shot of. And here, let me read it. Sans les livres, j'aurais cédé à l'absolu le plus ravageur du moment, le religieux. Without books, and he means literary books, novels, I would have succumbed to the most ravaging of absolutes, namely the religious. And he says something at the same time about ideology, that these are the two totalitarians. There's kind of the religious extremism and ideological totalitarianism, and that somehow literature was a space of freedom for him. And I think that one of the huge blessings that the modern era has conferred upon ordinary citizens, any citizens that have access to a library, that have access to books, is the possibility of what I would like to call ancestor adoption. You adopt an ancestor, and it's not because you admire or imitate a dead writer or something of that sort. It's that somehow there's this secret kind of subterranean connection across generations among the dead. When Camus, when Daoud speaks about the cult of the dead, I think he's talking about the tyranny that the tribal dead have on a particular society. But clearly, when I asked him the question about whether he considered Albert Camus a brother, he answered in the interview, if you've read it, that no, he considers him more of a kind of father figure, not a father figure, but a kind of father. And if you think that Charles Baudelaire, the 19th century poet, one of the last entries that he wrote in his journal called My Heart Laid Bare, he says, I am going to pray from now on to my father, my governess, I don't remember her name, and Edgar Allan Poe, that they would intercede for me so that I can be productive and I can make my work. And this is very interesting because the relationship between Edgar Allan Poe and Baudelaire goes on to have a huge impact on the future of French modernist literature. So here you have a poet praying to his biological father and his governess, and to Edgar Allan Poe, an American who had never been in France, and whom he considered one of his own. You don't pray to someone just because you admire them. You pray to them because you think that there's this elective affiliation. And that affiliation is one that literature, the whole archive of literature, opens up to anyone who just has the interest and imagination to read books. And I think everyone who is a reader, here I'm flattering all of you and us here tonight, have a number of elective ancestors. I mean, Dante doesn't write the Divine Comedy without Virgil, who he adopted as an ancestor. And there's any number of writers don't achieve what they achieve unless they either they chose, but sometimes even more mysterious, sometimes it's the dead ancestors that will choose you to be an elective heir, as it were. You can be Virginia Woolf. How many of us here have heard Virginia Woolf's voice in our ears, and that she's choosing us to be the thing? So I think it's going to be interesting for us all this evening to discuss the very complex and conflicted relation that someone like Kamel Daoud has to someone who is clearly one of his adoptive ancestors, which is Albert Camus. So with that, I'm going to ask Michaela to start us off with her opening salvo.
Okay, well, first of all, I wanted to just thank you, Robert, for inviting me, and say it's an honor to be on a panel with both of you. Thank you to my students. Thank you to the Sleep people for coming. I'm excited to be here to talk about this novel. I think it's probably the perfect novel to talk about in a series called Another Look, because Kamel Daoud is doing just that with The Stranger. He's giving it another look. Why might an Algerian novelist and journalist who sees literature as a space for self-reflection, why might he be interested in looking at this story? In my remarks tonight, I'll try to answer that deceptively simple question that Robert just introduced for us. Why is Kamel Daoud interested in giving The Stranger another look? There's so many stories out there. Why retell this one? So I thought I would explore three progressively more complex and hopefully three better answers to this question as I go. I wanted to start with a standard answer that you might arrive at if you started with a post-colonial literary tradition or a post-colonial counter tradition that some call writing back. So writing back to a colonial center. Daoud's definitely not the first to do this. So Aimé Césaire wrote A Tempest, a rewriting of Shakespeare's The Tempest, or there are a few retellings of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. There's the J.M. Coetzee Foe, or Michel Tournier wrote a text called Friday, or The Other Island. So this gesture of like writing back to a colonial center is seen as an attempt to reject the dehumanization central to that original literary frame, to give voices or to give names to nameless marginalized characters in the process. So I thought I would read from page 48 in our text in the Meursault investigation, where the narrator says, he's talking about The Stranger, "I read it 20 years after it came out, and it overwhelmed me with its sublime lying and its magical accord with my life. A strange story, isn't it? Let's summarize. We have a confession written in the first person, but we have no other evidence to prove Meursault's guilt. His mother never existed, for him least of all. Musa was an Arab replaceable by 1,000 others of his kind, or by a crow even, or a reed, or whatever else. The beach has disappeared, erased by footprints or agglomerations of concrete. The only witness was a star, namely the sun. The plaintiffs were illiterate and they moved out of town. And finally, the trial was a wicked travesty put on by idle colonials. What can you do with a man who meets you on a desert island and tells you that yesterday he killed a certain Friday? Nothing. So when you read that description of the stranger, the Meursault investigation seems like it is an example of writing back in some crucial senses. Like he has this example where he says the word Arab is repeated 25 times in Camus' text. He's taking up this frame. It's written from the perspective of the native Algerian family. It's investigating the crimes of the settler colonial figure in Camus' novel. But in other senses, this sort of feels deflating. And Daoud says himself in an interview, this is in French, that the novel is not an attack on the stranger. He says that this has led to some misunderstandings of the text. He said, I'm not an ancien moujahid, by which he meant I'm not a martyr for the cause. I'm not an FLN fighter. Referring to the independence fighters who secured independence for Algeria after a bloody war for independence from 1954 to 1962. Daoud wants something else. He wants a sort of radical freedom for art or for literature. And I think when you actually read the novel, as many of you have tonight, and you stop thinking of it as an idea for a novel, like what if you rewrote the story of the stranger, you're left with a sense of ambivalence. It doesn't really read like a political novel. It doesn't read, it reads more as a departure from the expectations you might have had when you started it. So I think it's not a good example of what Jean-Paul Sartre would have called littérature engagée or engaged literature. And I'll talk about what that category is in a minute. So now a new question emerges. If it's not just a political response to the omissions or insufficiencies or racism of Albert Camus' The Stranger, what is it doing on the level of the imagination and what are the stakes? So to contextualize the stakes of writing imaginatively or having the radical freedom to do so, I wanted to tell you a story about the reception of Francophone literature in France and the imposition of politics on their writing. So it's a story that has 3 acts, so bear with me. First act of the story is a meetup of the Surrealists in post-war France. And so the Surrealists wanted to captivate their audiences by unleashing the dream world, and they really wanted their art to be free from politics. They wanted to secure a place for art that was free from committing to either against fascism or in any position whatsoever. So think of Salvador Dali's Melting Clocks and Magritte's Pipe That's Not a Pipe. But after the war, in the aftermath of the large-scale loss of human life and reckoning with collaboration, the large-scale deportation of Jews, it seems sort of wrong to be focusing just on the imagination. So at this meetup in post-war France, Yves Bonnefoy, French poet, he says, doesn't the recourse to the imaginary mean breaking bonds with humanity? So he worried about this. So that's Act 1. Act 2 is the French philosopher that I just mentioned, Jean-Paul Sartre. He is really taken by the fact that Bonnefoy worried about this. So he has a very cringeworthy pun because Bonnefoy literally means good faith. Jean-Paul Sartre says that Bonnefoy is in good faith for having argued that we should be worried about the bonds between fellow man. So anyway, in his work, What is Literature from 1948, Sartre quotes Bonnefoy and says, literature should be political in some way. So he comes up with this category called littérature engagée, and he thinks that literature should work towards furthering the conditions of freedom for more and more people. And so who does he have in mind? Maybe someone like Camus, actually. So their relationship is complicated, and we don't have time to get into that. But he thinks that someone like Camus and literature engagée more broadly offers a defense of humanity by writing politically. So the final act, Act 3 in the story, is that Francophone writing, so writing in French from the former empire, becomes overwritten by this idea that it's always already politics, meaning that there's this burden of commitment that any art, any literature from Algeria will be a political literature. So in an interview with Robert Zaretsky for the LARB almost 10 years ago, Kamel Daoud said, one mustn't read a novel like this, meaning his own novel, as if it were an essay. Literature goes beyond good and evil. Camus was aware of colonial injustices, but literature is a dream that cannot be controlled and does not lie. A novel is not a pedagogical exercise, but the revelation of meaning. It does not accommodate itself to justice, but a vision of reality it can transform. Or in his interview with Robert Harrison, the quote that you just read, I refuse to read novels with a passport in my head. So my point is that we should be wary of overwriting the text as just counter politics, even if it is a contre-enquête. So instead, what I'm going to propose instead is that it's an occupation of contested cultural space. So that's my second answer to this guiding question, why this interest in returning to Camus? So I think an occupation of contested cultural space as an alternative to the nation state is really provocative when it comes to thinking about a novel like this. So there's a multilingual, multicultural, transnational community that probably a lot of us share in, where we've read The Stranger. We've had some sort of formative event, schooling event maybe, where we've read The Stranger and we know its basic plot points, we know about its controversies, we know something about the absurd. So it has an afterlife that has created a global community of readers. It's been translated into almost, I think, 60 languages, sold more than 6 million copies. Why does this matter? It's significant because in the aftermath of something like the Algerian War, where people do not agree about the basic facts of how that war happened, where people's memories cannot be reconciled, this is a place where we can meet. This is something that we can agree upon. So in 2021, the French President Macron, who Daoud interviewed on this subject as a journalist, he said he ruled out apologizing to Algeria for colonial abuses, but he said he would work towards reconciliation. So there's a whole committee on like reconciling memory. But if this dynamic feels far away, think about an analog to the US involvement in contemporary wars. Returning to The Stranger as a frame invites us to question whether cultural memory is really a zero-sum game, meaning like if I assert my right to exist, then you have to give up your right to exist. So an example of this kind of zero-sum thinking comes at the climax of the Meursault investigation, as her and the narrator is about to kill the Frenchman in the shed. So on page 83, it's just one word on 83, and then it goes to 84. He says, "The man was there, wedged between 2 stories and some walls, and his only way out was my story, which left him no chance." So I think we're meant to be critical of this logic. Like, it's either my story or your story, and if I'm going to survive, then you have to cease to exist. The narrator does briefly establish his sense of self by killing in this episode, and he's relieved, but it wears off quickly. He's disillusioned again when there's no real consequences for his actions. There's a kind of eschatological or end times feel in the wake of killing the Frenchman. It's not being written as a righteous fight for independence or writing back in that sense. He says things like, it's a story of Cain and Abel, but at the end of mankind and not the start. He says that the only verse in the Quran, and I mean the narrator, that resonates with him is the one that says, if you kill a single person, as if you have killed the whole of mankind. He says he's stuck between the end of the world and the beginning of a trial. So with the anti-colonial struggle comes more gratuitous, unexpected killing, like the one in The Stranger, like the murder in The Stranger, even though these are sanctioned by the independence struggle. And in the dark absurdity of the novel, Haroun kills too late to be excused. The officer says, you should have killed him with us during the war, not last week. Okay, so using The Stranger, using the novel as a frame, gets readers to question the idea that memory is a zero-sum game. And it keeps readers in this intermediary zone between action, reaction, between countries and their official memories. So this brings me to my third and final answer, why return to Camus? I think occupying this literary imaginary of The Stranger as a global text, using this intermediary zone, provocatively pulls us into these ethical deliberations. This dynamic is supposed to involve us. We're not allowed to sit on the sidelines. So again, think back to this dynamic wherein writing from Algeria is seen as somehow political or over there or anthropology or history, and we can sit on the sidelines. I think Daoud wants to reject that dynamic. Where do we see this most prominently in the text is the use of the second person. We're there, the narrator talks directly to us in a bar, which connects it maybe more closely with The Fall, another one of Camus' novels. We are the proxy for the judge, the prosecutor, the public, and the journalists. We're supposed to be the ones looking into this. So I think that this gets us to question ethical dilemmas we might usually in literature or in life ignore, meaning killing done in the name of a nation or killing done far away from us. Specifically, as I've discussed, the taking of human life. So there's this line in the novel, no one kills a specific individual during the war. I think the novel's trying to get us to question, aren't there higher laws than that? And so it's always directly involving us in these deliberations, questioning the cycle of violence that begins for Daoud with colonialism. So one last quote for you on page 105. He writes, "I didn't collaborate with the colonists and everyone in the village knew it, but I wasn't a mujahid either. And it bothered a great many people that I was sitting there in the middle, in that intermediary state, as if I was taking a nap under a rock on the beach or kissing a beautiful young woman's breast while my mother was getting robbed or raped." So this intermediary zone, or he calls it an intermediary state, is living. Like, isn't that where we want to exist? So colonialism, as the theorist Frantz Fanon writes about it, is as much a psychic phenomenon as it is a historic or economic or material one. So it changes the way bodies move through space. It changes their sense of humanity. So I was thinking of Fanon when Haroun references Amar Barati, the Indian ascetic who is said to have kept his right hand raised toward the sky for nearly 40 years, sort of an aside in the novel. So Haroun compares this posture of opposition that his mother gets stuck into Amar Barati. And he kind of makes this parallel to contemporary Algerian society, like stuck in a posture of opposition that makes it actually impossible to live or impossible to move freely. And I think the novel's uncomfortable because killing a random Frenchman by the light of the moon doesn't enact justice for the Arab killed under the burning sun. So Daoud's novel presents these two actions, these two murders, as two sides of the same coin. Inverses tied together as doubles, like Zuj, the name he gives his brother. So an image that stuck with me that kind of reflects this is the inverse shapes that the name of the bar takes. So the regulars call this bar that we're in with the narrator the Titanic. So this like boat, the sinking ship, that's kind of like a sinking angular ship filled with Europeans, but the sign on the door says Jebel Zendel, this mountain peak in the Atlas region. So they're like these kind of inverses to each other. Right at the beginning, he says, the story we're talking about should be rewritten in the same language from right to left. So French is a language that proceeds from left to right, Arabic from right to left. But here's a story written in French, but taking the inverse route, taking the other direction. So I'll end with Joe's striking response to the question Robert asked him about whether he considers himself an exile in France or an exile in Algeria. And he says, like all Algerians, I'm French. All Algerians are French. Some refuse to be, some want to escape, and some want to be more French than the French. And the French are bound by Algerian history, even in amnesia. It's too late. This is a quote from Mahmoud Darwish. It's too late. You're already Palestinians. We're already Israelis, replied the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish to an Israeli journalist. So the novel's not a pedagogical exercise. It demands that we, a global readership, hold together these seemingly opposed double stories in the way only the imagination can. It's like a dream that can't lie. Thanks.
What a daring thing it was for Daoud to decide of all novels to write back to the stranger. I think you mentioned the novel that was written in response to Robinson Crusoe. I would also highly recommend Jane Reese's Wide Sargasso Sea, which is her answer to Jane Eyre. It's a wonderful novel, but what courage it takes. I have actually considered doing something like that myself, but you're almost certain then to write something that will suffer by comparison. Why invite such a comparison? But there's great courage, I think, in the undertaking itself, and it's redeemed certainly by the art of Daoud in this. It doesn't only. This can be seen. I'd be curious to hear what you think as a a flourish, or it could be a weakness in the novel, how closely in some ways he adheres to and kind of recapitulates the stranger. For example, in The Stranger, there's the famous scene when Meursault rejects the attempts of the priest to excite him to a religious self-reflection and repentance. And Harun does the same thing with the imam who visits him. I mean, those are almost like bookended scenes. Even in some of the language, Meursault's famous Declaration of Independence, I was right, I was right, I was always right. Harun says the same thing in his in his final declaration of his independence from the judgments of others. Robert sent out this interview with Daoud, in which at one point Daoud says, incidentally, that was a great interview. Thank you for that. He's talking about this, the way in which Daoud responds to Camus' way of talking about who we now know as Harun as the Arab, only as the Arab. And Daoud says, to name is to hesitate to kill. And I think that's a kind of key in a way to the novel. He is able to hold that man in a depersonalized condition, makes it possible. But it's also important, I think, Daoud almost deliberately, I think, confuses in his description, in his response to this account, as if it were a real thing that was out there, not a novel, but a real story. There's a kind of deliberate confusion of Camus and Meursault in the way he responds to the account of the murder that we get in The Stranger, as if they were in a sense the same. And I think it's important when we follow Daoud's the cold fury really that underlies this novel, that someone could be written out of their identity by a word, the Arab, and his response to that, to fully inhabit an identity and make you see it, to be seen beyond that word. We need always to keep Camus, the writer, separate from Meursault, the character. That is a characteristic of Meursault that Camus created. And it has an effect in the novel that is calculated and makes it possible for him to commit this murder. So in his response to the novel, I think that Daoud is responding, in a sense, almost more to the character that Camus has created than to the writer of that novel. In reading these two novels together in the last several days, I have been struck again by what I consider to be the glittering beauty and perfection of Camus' novel. I was completely taken by it again. And the ending of it, again, this sense that he has throughout the novel, really, that his pleasure in living and being on a balcony and watching people return from a soccer game, of being in the water, of being under the sun, of being with a woman, the life that he feels inhabiting him. He is alive, and that persists even to the end. There's a kind of wonderful courage at the end in his insistence on seeing the beauty of the city outside his bars and hearing the sounds of music and cars and the world being alive. And that was something that made me love this novel all over again. Well, I've talked enough.
Thank you both of you. Then a lot to discuss. I reread The Stranger too, and I thought, wow, what a crystalline novel. But I have to say that having read Daoud's Meursault investigation, I realized that Camus, that this is, how can I say that so much is left out of it that you don't realize how partial is Camus' novel until you read Daoud, and then you realize that as some physician has claimed in a recent publication, that Camus describes the Asperger syndrome 2 years before it was actually classified as a disorder, because Meursault is without, well, he exhibits all the symptoms of someone who lacks a verbal communication, doesn't understand gesture, doesn't understand. And his love of life that you find so moving at the end, yeah, if you get drawn in, if you get seduced by that, then you can think it's very beautiful, but it makes you forget that he's a murderer. He took a lot.
There's that.
Exaltation of life can you accept from a murderer?
No, that's true. Yeah.
His murder was so.
Yeah.
I think when I spoke about elective affiliation, I believe that Daoud, what he inherits from Camus, and maybe you can weigh in on this, is a sense that one has to be open to the, this possibility of identifying oneself with in categories that are not already pre-established, either national or ethnic or colonial, post-colonial, and things of that sort. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's also a kind of challenge to our own academic habits and literary criticism, where we categorize everything immediately. We say, well, Daoud is a post-colonial writer, or he's writing about that Camus himself was a colonialist writer or something of that sort. We're always so quick to put things in categories, but I think the idea that literature is too subversive on the imaginary level for that to take place, I think unites the two authors in this kind of allegiance to literature against the overriding ideologies of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm reminded of a conversation, a sort of debate between Chekhov and his editor Suvorin, who was continually pushing him to take more of a stand politically, because of course a lot of things were going on in Russia at the time, as in Algeria during Camus' time, and Chekhov insisted, I am a free artist and nothing more. And I think that's very much in the spirit of Camus' novel here.
I mean, I think maybe one difference is Camus seems to be neither Algerian nor French, and he's like, he sees himself, and he's been received as sort of an exile in both spaces, whereas Daoud seems to be claiming both with that provocative answer, like we're already both. So it kind of
binational.
Yeah, so all Algerians are French and French are Algerian. So he's kind of continuing this uncomfortable logic of Algeria being a French department. And so he's saying we're still tied together. So it kind of reminds me of Edouard Glissant, had this line about colonialism, where he said, colonization is people living together. And people were aghast because it was like not a very post-colonial thing to say. And what he meant by that is like people live their lives, and there's the intermediary state that makes up most of it. So it can't be written as counter politics a lot of the time. So I think Daoud's perspective gives more space to that, and rather than not.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
So a question maybe, Michaela, if you ever teach The Stranger in the future, can you see yourself teaching The Stranger without including this book by Daoud? Do you think after the publication of this book that it can still stand alone on its own?
Can The Stranger stand alone?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a hard question, because I think a lot of times in French studies, like you teach The Stranger with Sisyphus or with ideas of the absurd. And so it seems natural, if you have like a capacious understanding of how this conversation continues, to include Daoud there. But it's sort of the delight and the difficulty of ever teaching anything, which is like everything's connected to everything else. So it's like, yes, there's Camus and there's Daoud, but they're just 2 points on this long continuum.
What do you think about that, Toby? I mean, you said you were so struck by the glittering perfection of the novel. I thought so too, but now I think it's a very incomplete. It's a glittering incomplete novel.
Because you've read this one.
Yes.
Well, now we've entered a world where these novels do exist and are in conversation, and we can't see that and unknow that. But the truth of the matter, this novel has stood on its own for a long time, and this novel depends on it completely. This could not stand alone as it is now without the existence of this. This is, I think it's impossible to imagine a world now that I've read this and, in concert with reading this, where this doesn't exist. So I mean, The Stranger has not, for me, lost any of its completeness and perfection because of the existence of this novel, but it has enriched my understanding, no, without question. Yeah.
But one thing about Asperger's syndrome is that the person suffering from it doesn't have any concept of the consequences of his or her actions. And the Meursault investigation to me is kind of opening up what is completely suppressed in The Stranger, which is what are the consequences of that action, not philosophical. Okay, he turns it into a philosophical murder, but the philosophy, then we can go on, speaking in abstractions, but the Meursault investigation fleshes out the lived consequences and suffering and grief and unending, interminable sort of mourning process, and all the pathology that is created in the aftermath of what in Camus' novel is an act gratuit. It's a gratuitous act, and everyone exalts it as this height of this absurdity, and we champion the philosophy of absurdity. This brings it back to the fact that a human being has been killed, and that there are people who are left over. And this is, a story of the consequences of the gratuitous act.
Yeah. Well, he has a line in Daoud in the investigation about, again, he's treating this not as a novel, but as a real account of the murder, Daoud is, of his brother. And he said, because of the existence of this text, my brother is murdered incessantly for 70 years, that it's a continual process of murder. And that, that's a tough, wonderful line, I think, and wakes us up to that very thing you're talking about.
I mean, if you think about the Algerian War being talked about in France as les événements, like the events, and then you have a novel this famous that doesn't name its victim, and that's taught in every French department in the country, that
every school,
I mean,
every high school student, the baccalaureate, it's always pourquoi Meursault a tué l'arabe? Why did Meursault kill the Arab? They always come up with the same answer. Du soleil, because of the sun.
Yeah, so I mean, if you think it's like it's hiding in plain sight, it's this national historical trauma, but one that you don't know that you're even talking about. So
well, given that, then there's talking about how literary history involves these genealogies, because you can say, yeah, okay, Camus' novel can stand on its own, it doesn't need Daoud. You could say that Dante's Divine Comedy can't stand on its own because it needs Virgil. If you don't know Virgil, you don't know Dante's, doesn't make much sense. But then you go read Virgil's Aeneid, and if you don't know Homer, Aeneid doesn't stand up because Homer was Virgil's adoptive ancestor. Virgil was Dante's adoptive ancestor. And these are the ways in which elective affiliations take place in literary history.
That's right.
Now, I want to go back to the session that I attended of another book eight years ago. I don't know if it was 8 or 7, something, where the stranger was under discussion. And Marie-Pierre Uloa, you remember our colleague here at Stanford, was one of the participants on that panel. And when she read my interview with Daoud, that she sent me, and I got her permission to mention this, but she sent me a really fascinating story that she herself has written and has not yet published, which is a continuation of the unspoken, the incomplete story, which is, who is the woman? Cherchez la femme. This, Daoud, the narrator here says, oh, there's always a woman somewhere in the background. And in fact, you get these very elusive intimations that there is a woman at the bottom of this whole story, of the untold story. Daoud is very, I'm going to call him Daoud Haroun, the same, right? He does Haroun. The same. Yeah. He's very contemptuous. But if you look on page, I think it's 18, 19 in our book, but this is, he mentions that the mother and Musa, before he died, that there was a woman in between, there was a perfume, there was a kind of thing, there was a kind of tension, there was a female rivalry. And he says, Mama never spoke about it, but in our neighborhood after the crime, I was often greeted, this is the bottom of page 19, I was often greeted as the heir of some recovered honor, though I could never figure out the reasons why, child that I was. Nevertheless, I knew it, I could feel it. By telling me so many implausible tales and outright lies, Mama eventually aroused my suspicions. And then he goes on, oh, the mystery woman. And he describes this, a woman staring at us early in the morning when they're leaving Algiers for good. A very intense stare. She was wearing a short skirt and tacky stockings, and it seems to me she'd done her hair like the movie star in those days. Although she was quite obviously a brunette, her hair was dyed blonde. Zubida, he gives her a name, which is, and Zubida is apparently a very disdainful name. I think it's supposed to mean peace or something. The point being is that this woman doesn't get a voice. And in The Stranger, the whole ruckus that provokes the conflict between the Arabs and the Frenchman is a woman, a prostitute. So our colleague Marie-Pierre Uloa has written a very compelling narrative, which I read just the other day, in the voice of this woman, whom Daoud silences. Harun just accuses of being just nothing but a slut and hardly worthy of any sort of attention. And she tells a completely different story about what happened, where she is not the sister, because Camus, I mean, in The Stranger, it's one of the Arabs is trying to redeem the honor of the sister who has been befouled by Raymond. No, it's not the sister, it's a lover, it's a prostitute, and so forth. So it's very interesting to read a third installation of this in the voice of a woman who has been silenced. I believe that Daoud understood that he had been guilty of the same thing he's accusing Camus of, namely not naming the Arabs. And then he wrote the book that just won the Prix Goncourt. He won the equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize last week for this novel, which is in the voice of a woman. And it's the voice of a woman whose throat has been slit, by the way, in the Algerian décennie noire, the Black Decade of the Civil War. And you know, some people, including Marie-Pierre, I shouldn't go on record, but nevertheless, the idea that he had to make up for his own sort of silence and suppression of this other story. So this is what's great about literature.
Yeah.
There are always these untold stories within even the most perfect, glittering story. And it takes other voices to bring them out and into this realm of accessibility.
Yeah.
Well, if you let me argue with you a bit.
Yeah.
I said, well, so if there is a distance between Daoud and Harun, Daoud's committed to Harun being sort of sexist, misanthrope. And so he writes this, yes, he silences Zubida's story, but she's almost like another one of the ghost in the bar. She's just this peripheral character. He's so consumed as a character by the family drama that he might be inventing this, you know, she might have just been watching them leave. So I think it's interesting, like there's if he is supposed to be doing politics, by be doing justice to all the untold stories, then I think that that's right. Then I think that there are still untold ones. But I wonder if Daoud is committed to this character and his worldview and his insufficiencies and his limitations and his reasoning. I don't know what you think of that.
Well, there's other indications in the text that there is a woman somehow in the background of the whole story, and that Harun just treats with a certain amount of disdain the idea that it just happened to happen on a beach. He thinks that there was motivation, because this is always the reason The Stranger, which is not my favorite novel by a long shot, because there's something of, I understand that Proust was the god of French letters and novel, and it's all about introspection and interiority and so he wrote a novel that had no aspirations, no interiority, nothing, just at the same time, Daoud or Harun is completely skeptical about the easy assumption that there's no motivation in Meursault's actions. He's saying, no, there was a motivation, but Meursault is not telling us what the motivation is. And it's Marie-Pierre turns it into a very specific scene where she takes the scene in The Stranger, you remember, in the building where Raymond is beating the prostitute thing, and makes the whole thing quite real, that she was a very real presence that was at the heart of the whole thing, and it was all planned. And it's called The Trigger, that she calls it like a shit acide. It's the line from The Stranger, the trigger gave way.
Yeah, the trigger gave way.
The trigger gave way.
He doesn't say I pulled the trigger.
No,
The trigger gave way. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to go into all the details, but it's because Daoud himself seems to suggest that there's more to what happened on the beach than what Camus Meursault says in that novel. He doesn't go into it very much more, but this new retelling does. And I think it's quite fascinating.
Interesting.
Well, we're open to any questions from the audience, online or in presence. Yes, can we get a, we'll start with you, Jan, and then you. Go ahead, Jan. Okay, you go next.
You made the comment that the question is, why did he shoot her? And your comment was that it's always because of the sun. Okay? What else do you see happening besides that? Because your comment was rather negative. And then you put that down, that's always the answer. Is there any other answer that you have as to what happened?
The only thing I would offer is just partially why I think it's become this cliche is because when the answer is because of the sun, it's the perfect illustration of an absurdist theory. So the novel becomes a vehicle for the philosophical idea. But I don't know, is there something else there that I think Camus plants?
There's a, he does produce a knife. Defense on the beach, and it's a vital scene. It takes place there.
So this is another thing I just read it today about the Asperger's, and he said they don't understand the language of gesture. And Meursault says, the sun was so hot, I wanted to get into the shade, so I moved forward into, not realizing that the guy lying in that shade took that as a threatening gesture and brought out his knife. If I wanted to take seriously the answer that Meursault gives at his trial, I killed him because of the sun, I would say the following. I didn't bring the stranger with me, but if you read that scene, it's really quite remarkable the way it's real hot. It's probably like 40, 42 degrees centigrade, and the whole scene is that it's as if time is coming to a complete standstill. And paralysis, everything, and that the only way to save time and is to kind of produce an act, a kind of violence, to get time to start up again. Admittedly, this is giving Camus all the credit for having constructed a brilliant philosophical motive for Meursault, which this story doesn't want to go into, but where is it here? Yeah, so it's my veins were throbbing under the skin. It was this burning which I couldn't stand anymore that made me move forward. I knew that it was stupid, but I wouldn't get the sun off me by stepping forward. But I took one step forward, and this time the Arab drew his knife and held it up to the sun. So it's the Arab who feels threatened first, right?
And it's glinting into
Right,
his
the
eyes.
shot, the light shot off the steel, and it was like a long flashing blade cutting at my forehead. But I want to go. I want to. I won't go into it, but if you reread this passage, page 58, I think it's a very dramatic thing where there's some kind of blockage. Something has to get unblocked, and it's by putting it's unblocked.
And also you understand the Arabs bristle in response to this kind of always kind of colonization of the land that the guy is occupying, an assertion of some kind of sense of ownership over that place that the other man occupies. And so there's so many of those streams of conflict are coming together on this beach.
I mean, the thought in my head is that there's this building up of these sort of banal details that end in this catastrophic action. So there's two parts to the novel, and so it all builds to this. And then the second part is just the justice process afterward. He refuses to repent, and he refuses. There's no explanation really on either end of these two pieces of the novel. So I think it skirts the bigger, like the actual question. So it's interesting, or it's funny that on the back they always ask, like, why did he kill this person? But really it's a novel about why is there any meaning on either side, like either in the justice process or in Camus itself. And so that's sort of, I think, the bigger question that we spend.
And part of the symmetry that Toby was talking about is that in the case of the stranger, he's being condemned more for not mourning his mother, probably. Whereas in the case of Harun, it's because he killed him a week too late.
Yeah.
The murder itself is not the issue.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit what do you think about the mother figures in the novel? Because, in Camus, you have this disinvolvement and complete detachment. Oh, thank you.
Can you repeat your question for the online?
Okay, so my question is about the mother figures in both novels, because in Camus, you have the complete detachment and disinvolvement at the mother's death being crucial for the novel, while Camus himself always sided with his mother, even against justice. And here we have a completely oppressive mother who is pathologically driven by the loss of her first son. And the act of liberation is to finally no longer having to stick with the mother. So there is an inversion here, and I wanted to know what you do with it.
I mean, I want to read this from the French, the contre-enquête. There's this line, I think this is in the 7th chapter. Harun says, la mère, the mother, la mort, death, l'amour, tout le monde est partagé inégalement entre ses pôles de fascination. So the mother, death, and love, the whole world is pulled between these objects of fascination. And I think you could add the C, like la mère, so he's playing, I think, with these M symbols and figures, and so he takes them from Camus, and then they're these movers in his novel that, like you said, like I think it's another inversion where it's tied to Camus, but he's inverting some of the structures.
Right. Both narrators in these novels, in describing their mothers when they're at home with them, talk about their eyes following them in the house. They both do that. Daoud picks that up too, but that sense of being watched and in some way oppressed by the attention of their mothers.
Well, both Camus and Daoud have, biographically speaking, they had mothers who, I think Daoud's mother is dementia and can't, for a long time hasn't been speaking.
Yeah.
And here by the end, she's also mute.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Camus' mother was also mute and deaf, and therefore they communicated really not through language, the logos, but through gestures, and it was objects. And I think that is exactly the kind of novel that what's so revolutionary about The Stranger is that it's all external, it's not linguistic, it's autistic, yeah. And I think the mother, but I asked that question of Daoud in my interview, and because I tried to suggest, is the mother's refusal to bring an end to the grieving process, and does it represent something about Algeria which cannot historically, according to them, get over the War of Independence? We were speaking about this earlier, that it's still the governing body of Algeria is all these generals and other people who were part of the War of Independence, and the average age of the people in the upper echelons of the government is 85 years of age. Because it's, and he speaks about this need to be liberated from the cult of the dead. And of course, the mother in the Meursault investigation is the very cult of the dead, of her dead son. And the last thing that she wants is to allow the dead son to actually have the peace of the dead, but to continue being haunted by the past. And I think Algeria is, I don't know from the inside, I'm just going on the basis of what Daoud has said in interviews and also, is that the mother does, in a certain sense, represent the refusal to allow the past to be past. It's like being in a zombie state when you're neither alive or dead, when you can't let the dead take their proper place in the afterlife. Please.
One thing that is not uninteresting is that Haroun's names were killed. And not only that, I haven't, but at least he's known that for quite some time. And it seemed to me that he were upset about the anonymity of his brother, but he wouldn't name this man at all. He'd say, I killed a Frenchman, and he deserved it, and leave it at that.
Well, that might add a little more to what Toby was saying, that there's a lot of replication, and that it might have been just too much making it the mirror image of master text.
I mean, there's something almost ridiculous about how specific, like Joseph Larquet, like he's named him, and he's given him this very specific name, and they've taken over this other family's house at that point. So I think it's interesting that you point that out. Like, I think it's this almost comic feel to his naming of this character, especially since he doesn't really seem to stand by killing him as a symbolic act eventually. So it's like he's named here, but he doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about remorse or his family, or so he's named, but it's almost ridiculous. I don't know.
But it's as meaningless.
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems to be the mothers behind him actually pushing him.
Right.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. Thank you, Michaela, for inviting us. I was really struck by the discussion of kind of how political is this text? Should we view this text as political and stuff? And I was wondering if you guys think that Meursault and Daoud were like investigating their own politics as or before they were writing, kind of in the understanding of the fact that Meursault chooses not to name the Arab, like is that a conscious choice? And also, you guys were talking about a little bit about how like the literary world really likes to categorize text as post-colonial, colonial. So how do you think we can make the literary world kind of more expansive and in a way that like even when the general consumer consumes these texts, they don't immediately kind of shift to categorization?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I guess one thought that I had reading this, especially given the recent news that he won the Prix Goncourt, is that there's a lot of people who have read Daoud because he returned to The Stranger. So a lot of people who, again, like even if you didn't choose to read The Stranger, like a teacher made you read it, or you just knew it was an important book and so you thought you should read it, or so even however you came to The Stranger, I'm curious how people eventually read The Stranger. You might have been interested in Kamel Daoud because he rewrote The Stranger, but that's not the end of his literary career, and so now he's written all these other things. So I think part of it is this deliberate gesture to dialogue with the past, the way Robert was talking about, or choose like he calls him his a father figure. So, but I don't think it's necessarily the end of the conversation. And so I think Camus is more complicated. I think Camus, his politics didn't lend him again to either side. Like he was sort of into an assimilationist idea of Algeria. And so that made him unloved by the FLN and made him unloved by France. So it was sort of, he had a complicated relationship to Algerian independence projects. But Daoud, on the other hand, he's very outspoken. Like he wants radical freedom for the artist, and that puts him on the wrong side of certain politics. Like that's why he is a controversial figure, because he wants to be able to say what he wants about Islam, or he wants to be able to say what he wants about the Quran. So this again, like this puts him in a radical position in relationship to state ideology sometimes.
He wants the freedom of literature.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question from Lena Herzog, in our audience. Can you hear me now? This better. Lena Herzog writes, Fatzia's Disgrace and Daoud's The Meursault Investigation are novels permeated by nihilism that comes after liberation movements. Politics are not discussed in either one, but extreme clarity of how empty is the morning after is shocking. Thus, the pointless murder begins a pointless murder. Nihilism begets nihilism. Daoud said his book is not about revenge. What is it then? Some horrific balance? What is it?
Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like the coastal shelf. Get out as quickly as you can and don't have any kids yourself. Thank you, Philip Larkin.
But it's absolutely central, the question of nihilism, because that was certainly for Albert Camus in the mid-century, mid-20th century, after Nietzsche's whole philosophy of nihilism. Heidegger comes around, and Camus writes the rebel, which is his answer to nihilism, and he's really trying to find very explicitly some way to not to overcome nihilism, but not to succumb to nihilism. Right? And he did believe that the totalitarian movements of the 20th century were nihilistic precisely because they were thirsting for the absolute. And when the absolute is the only thing that will satisfy you, then any amount of nihilistic behavior, murder, destruction, and genocide will be permitted in the name of arriving at the absolute. And here again, Camus' answer in the novel is that one has to somehow wean oneself of this need to replace the God that has abandoned the world, the Christian God, with some new God, either the totalitarian state or some kind of other version of the absolute. And I go back to the quote that I mentioned in my introduction from Daoud, that literature is, had it not been for books, I would have succumbed to the worst ravages of the absolute, namely nihilism, namely the religious. So I think I would answer, I can speak for both of them. I think they share this sense that we have to learn to live in a kind of provisional condition where the absolute is beyond us, and not to cure ourselves from the nostalgia for it. That's, this thirsting for the absolute leads invariably to a kind of violence. It doesn't have any limit.
You mentioned something along the lines that the book is attempting to recapture the literature imaginary space. And I'm curious, to what degree does the Wood successfully manage to do that, or is he inevitably just participating in the literature space that are in the museum that might not be really like the space that he needs to exist?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think we were talking about this, I guess, in the context of like, can it stand alone, or does it need the stranger to stand with it? So I don't know. I think I'm kind of torn on that question, to be honest. I think that there are flickers of the imaginary. I think the fact that as a text, it can get you to reconsider something that you thought was stable. I think that is a provocative, imaginative act. So like you come in with an idea of the framework of the stranger, and he undoes that stealthily. Like that's a tricky, imaginative task to do. But I don't know if it allows itself to have that much fun. I think the bottle ghost is sort of fun and weird, and like there's that character who's in the bar and he's like cutting up newspapers and
Deaf and mute.
Yeah, and so he's sort of a supplement to the Camus architecture, and so that's kind of, it gets you to think about the cult of the dead and haunting and some of these theoretical questions about the afterlife of colonialism. But I think that's not, he didn't need to go into this near supernatural to do that. He could have just said that, explicitly with the content or with the theme. So I think there he's allowing himself a little bit of play with the imagination. But I think you're right in that it stays very tightly knitted, as I think your comments brought out, to even the ending, like to the structure, like they will greet me with cries of hate, like almost there's some, like the beginning and the end are just almost exact responses to Camus, or tied to Camus' own structure. So in that sense, I don't know how much of a departure it is.
Yeah, but how is that different from Dante when he quotes Virgil? When Virgil takes his leave, he quotes him in Latin, and then he quotes a translation in Italian, and then there's a panegyric. So much of the full of what nowadays we would call derivative, but it's the way in which the retrieval and rejuvenation of legacy.
Yeah.
Eliot does the same thing. He resurrects them both in the four quartets. He has Dante, and he and Dante, as he said, we walk the pavement in a dead patrol. And yeah, I mean, we're all, the blood is running through all of us.
I will say in the program that I teach in, we teach Dante, we sometimes teach Eliot, but we don't teach Virgil.
You don't teach Virgil.
No. So even if it's essential, or like you would understand it better if you had read Virgil, then it stands alone.
You would understand that all those figures come right out of physics. Anyway, the point is, I agree. It's that literary history is this. It's the idea that it's without passport. This is where you are not condemned to your own biological tribal dead. That you can have, relations with the dead that go beyond, your particular inheritance as human culture and another culture. And this is where, that's what the great problem of modernity is. I think is opening up a library, a universal library of collective affiliations cross-cultural. So, what do you say, Cynthia? You have one more question? What's that?
Your mic seems to be dead, so I think.
Oh.
I have one question. Thank you for holding this illuminating discussion.
You gave me the mic too soon.
Good point. Thank you for holding this illuminating discussion. I first read Daoud's work in a Stanford class on Camus taught by Marie-Pierre Hulot. I was wondering if you could speak to the status of the French language in Daoud's and Camus' novels. How do novels differ at the level of aesthetics and poetic prose? And what are their political implications of their respective relationships with the French language?
This would be for you too.
Oh, because I think your mic is dead.
Yeah.
It's a good question, and it merits a long answer, but maybe I'll just give a short one. One of the things that Haroon mentions is the sparseness of the prose of Camus' prose in The Stranger, and that's, I think, a departure. That's a thing where you can distinguish the two of them. There's the Meursault investigation is not quite as sparse in terms of detail or geometric in its narration. He also it seems to be almost more gratuitous, in his details than in The Stranger. But on this note of the mother, it's weird in the French that maman is M''Ma. So he sort of condensed it to it's even more casual. Yeah. So it's like an intensification of what Camus already did by saying today mother said aujourd'hui maman est morte, like by saying maman and not like my mother. It's a sort of colloquial, and it's like brings up like mother boy resonances, the fact that it's like the first line maman is in there. And it puts you on familiar terms with the character because he's like telling you that mama is dead, not today my mother died. And he's also hazy on the details, or maybe it was yesterday. In any case, this I think is intensified in the French, but yeah, there's more to say, I guess, in terms of why I choose to write this in French and what the politics of that are. But I think I would just go back to this, what Daoud seems to want is a global audience, and he's using French, or he's writing in French to call upon like a global French audience, not necessarily to reify a politics that points him back to France or something like that.
Yeah, what we should always remember that Camus wrote The Stranger under the influence of American fiction. Mm-hmm. And, the Hemingway style, the single short sentences and so forth. So in a certain way, you could say it's quite derivative of an American aesthetic, whereas Daoud's narrative is much more French. Well, I don't know if call it French. Let's say it's much less inhibited it's more expansive. It's more colloquial. It's like speech that you would actually get. And Daoud has said that he can't write slow. He has to write very fast. And he speaks very fast. If you hear him in his interviews, he speaks fast. So this is, it's not really a stream of consciousness technique, but it is an interior monologue, very much like Camus' The Fall, which is an interior monologue. And it flits back and forth. It doesn't have the lucidity. This is the weird thing, is that Camus being French, but The Stranger is so lucid, crystalline, and yet at the heart of all that luminosity is this darkness, impenetrability of finding out what is actually motivating people. Daoud's, the way in which it's not at all a mirror image of The Stranger is the fact that the narrator is very self-confessional, expansive, sharing his sentiments with the reader generously. And he's doing it in an idiom and a language and a kind of prose, which is, it's not manicured the way Proust's prose is manicured, where you have a sense that he's not, you know, la belle phrase, as they call it in French, you know, the beautiful sentence. He's not looking for beautiful sentences. He's really looking to communicate, I think, a pathos and emotion. And in that sense, I think it's a perfect complement to The Stranger, because it, you know, I get tired of Meursault. The guy, you know, it's like knock, knock, no one's home at a certain point. With Haroun, you have someone at home, and it's a pleasure to, you know, dialogue with him.
I love the way, the playful way that Daoud begins his novel. I mean, you know, playful isn't something that you would associate with this book particularly, but as you quoted the beginning of L'Étranger, aujourd'hui, maman est morte, you know, mother died today. Here's the opening of Daoud's, Mama's still alive today. I mean, that's throwing down the gauntlet right at the beginning. I just love the daring of that, you know, to take on this monument of literature with such a gesture at the beginning of his novel.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our